2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
Well, at one time, he was thought to be Donald Trump's biggest nemesis, and he appeared ready to wrestle the GOP from Donald Trump's grip. A series of missteps and calculations from the get-go, and no room to make an error. Ron DeSantis dropped out of the race over 8 months. There was not a lot DeSantis' camp could do right. Ultimately, Trump's popularity in Arctic weather did him in. And as I said, Sunday night, Governor Ron DeSantis abandoned the presidential trail. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Vote 2024, Path to the Polls. I'm joined by News4Jax political reporter Scott Johnson. Scott, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
So there are some people who said that the announcement Sunday night came as a surprise. Both you and I have talked to News4Jax political analyst and head of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, Rick Mullaney. And Rick basically said to me he wasn't surprised it came. Maybe he's surprised it came as early as it did before New Hampshire, but he says that Ron DeSantis bowed out at a time when he could do so gracefully and maybe set his sights on 2028.
And I think maybe save face a little going into the next round of the primary after New Hampshire, because the polling showed he could very well only get 5% in New Hampshire. That would be a political embarrassment to him if that happened. To be the guy who is supposed to be the heir apparent to Donald Trump and the GOP, he comes in a pretty distant second in Iowa. But if he only got 5%, way behind Trump and Nikki Haley in New Hampshire, that may have been politically untenable. And I was wondering, Bruce, if that was maybe what the tipping point for DeSantis was I don't want that political embarrassment, that asterisk, like he can't play nationally because look how badly he did in New Hampshire.
I think that was one of the tipping points. You've got the fact that he was counting on the evangelical group to come in his corner. They didn't seem to be responding to him. He was hoping that the independent voters would come into his camp. They didn't seem to be doing that. And the very fact of the matter is that he ran out of steam and he ran out of cash. You know, he's talking about some of the missteps along the way. The very first misstep was in making the announcement, according to political analysts, on Elon Musk's X, formerly known as Twitter. Then there was the whole debacle with the super PAC, and some people said that he was illegally using some of the campaign money. And he had a lot of donors who he thought were going to be in his camp. They started backing some of the other GOP candidates. And there were a number of things where he just, didn't have what he needed to move forward.
And there was the other thing that was the elephant in the room. He's running against Donald Trump. They're running in the same lane. They're going for the same voters. And as much as DeSantis did with his re-election bid in 2022 here in Florida, winning by about 20 points or so, he was the darling of the party in early 2023. But he's still going up against the guy who's essentially still the head of the party and still more well-known to everyone. DeSantis may be known, but Donald Trump has 100% name recognition. Love him or hate him, his base was what DeSantis was trying to peel off. And that was a tough road to hoe for him.
Donald Trump's a juggernaut here, and it's going to be curious to see where does the DeSantis vote go. And there are a lot of people who said that, that DeSantis made a very calculated move when he made his concession speech, or dropped out of the race yesterday. I don't know if you can call it a concession speech. Basically, he said, I'm going to keep my promise and go ahead, and I am going to go ahead and endorse Donald Trump. And that's interesting because in the waning days of the campaign, he started attacking Donald Trump and saying, look, he had 4 years, didn't keep all his promises. But now he's coming back into the fold, knowing that should he run again in 4 years, he may very well need Donald Trump's blessing.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot out there like, what's Ron DeSantis going to do now? First, he said Saturday, we reported here over the weekend, that he told a voter in New Hampshire, I will not run for vice president. I do not want that job.
Yeah, I don't want a position where you basically do nothing, I think was what he said.
Yeah, and I was talking to A.G. Ginkarski last night on the 10 o'clock news. He's a political reporter at Florida Politics. And he said, even though he doesn't want VP, that doesn't mean he won't show up back in Washington. He had speculated a few things. Attorney General, possibly. This is if Trump wins. Let me back up. This is if Trump is the nominee, because he's still going against Nikki Haley.
And he does have a Harvard law degree.
He does have a Harvard law degree, and he's got a background as a JAG lawyer in the Navy. And or possibly Supreme Court was something he was talked about if there's another vacancy on the Supreme Court. I know Clarence Thomas is getting up in years and others. So I don't know. It seems like he's mending that bridge with Donald Trump that seemed to have been frayed in the primary, and we'll have to see where it goes if Trump is in fact the nominee. But if Nikki Haley is the nominee and pulls off an unexpected comeback, I don't know that they necessarily are on good terms.
Now, you say that. We know a couple of things, that in the past couple of days, Donald Trump has widened the gap between he and Nikki Haley, and at one point there was single digits between them. Now it's double digits once again. But New Hampshire, when you look at it historically, is one of those states that brings about a lot of surprises. So we basically have to wait and see. This is Monday morning when we're doing this.
Yeah.
Dixie Notch is the first of the precincts to go ahead and vote at midnight tonight. I think there's only 7 or 12 people who vote there. But you never know what's going to happen in New Hampshire. And Nikki Haley has come into this and said, you know what? I'm very confident. You've got a much different electorate in New Hampshire than you did in Iowa. Iowa was very conservative. You've got a lot of independents and a lot of undecideds in New Hampshire. Now, Donald Trump wrongly stated that Democrats can vote in this primary election. Well, the only way that a Democrat could vote is if they change their political allegiance.
And one thing that will be interesting to watch is New Hampshire is Nikki Haley's probably her best shot here.
Her last shot.
Her last
probably
shot
her
to
best
knock
shot.
him off. And I've heard a lot of people on the GOP side say, this is over. That's their opinion. I saw Newt Gingrich say it recently. It's over. It is Donald Trump. He has won. We're just kind of going through the motions. But the only thing I wonder about, and they do, I'm not saying that their points don't have merit, but the thing I'm wondering about is if Nikki Haley pulls off an upset tomorrow, because DeSantis is no longer on the ballot. It's a one-on-one, and New Hampshire voters can really determine which way they want to go. What is the news cycle Wednesday morning? Because if Donald Trump loses a state in the GOP primary, the reality is the press is going to latch on to that like nothing we've
Right.
seen
And
before.
look, make no mistake about it. There are two headlines that could be possible here. Trump triumphs or Haley upsets.
Yeah.
And to your point, his name is Whit Ayers, and he is a GOP pollster. And basically his point was, look, coming into November here, there are a lot of voters who do not want to see a Trump-Biden matchup. So, you know, what kind of impact is that going to have when people go to the polls in New Hampshire? And we, as we mentioned, we do have to wait and see. May it make South Carolina, Super Tuesday, Florida, and the rest of the primaries irrelevant? I don't know.
And the other thing is Nikki Haley has got something DeSantis didn't. All the financial backing that was going to DeSantis moved to Haley, and a lot of the primary is about sustaining this state to state to state, having just the money to physically move yourself around from state to state to put ads on TV stations and radio ads and mailers in South Carolina and Nevada, which people overlook, which is coming up.
And she's the former governor of South Carolina. That's her turf.
Former governor of South Carolina. So she has a lot of money to keep this going. Will it be enough to really damage Donald Trump in the GOP primary? I don't know. I don't know that anyone knows. The reality most people believe is Trump will be the nominee, but she's got a lot of money, and now she's got the thing that we've never seen in this primary, a head-to-head face-off. One-on-one versus Donald Trump. That will be the interesting thing.
You mentioned those GOP donors. That's one of the things that Ron DeSantis counted on, and it was one of his miscalculations. A lot of those GOP donors left Ron DeSantis, and they left him for a couple of reasons. Because they'd listened to his speeches. They became almost rote, and they needed a thesaurus to figure out what he was talking about. He always said the same thing in the same way in an almost robotic manner. And then they started to wonder about his, well, basically his agenda. You know, and some of the things that he was doing here in Florida. So some of the people that he was depending on for financial support started abandoning him for other candidates like Nikki Haley. So how is that going to play in the future? Again, we have to adopt a wait-and-see attitude.
Yeah, and it was interesting to see DeSantis was the darling of the party 1 year ago at this time. Mm-hmm. Like, he was the heir apparent to Trump, and many people thought he would be able to put Trump out to pasture, so to speak, in the GOP side of things and be the new head of the party. That did not materialize. And a good thing is, look at Iowa. Iowa is going to a lot of that evangelical core who votes in that caucus is going to gravitate toward DeSantis' agenda. But he didn't get the numbers. He still lost to Trump by 30 points. And at the end of the day, if you can't beat Trump, you can't be the nominee of the party. And he tried to distance himself from Trump. Trump called him desanctimonious, and they would go back and forth. But at the end of the day, he couldn't get over that hump.
Yeah, and there are those who say, you know what, why are we even bothering with New Hampshire, that this is already over?
Sure.
All right, this morning on the morning show, this Monday morning, I talked with Daniel Cronrath. He's a political science professor at Florida State College, Jacksonville, and he had this take on Ron DeSantis, well, just saying no more on the presidential campaign trail. Well, at one point, he appeared to be Donald Trump's most daunting challenger, but his campaign ran out of steam, as you just heard. Steam, support, and money. Ron DeSantis ended his struggling bid before this week's New Hampshire primary. Joining me on the morning show, Daniel Cronrath, political science professor at FSCJ. Hey, good morning.
Good morning, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you here. So a face-saving move, and perhaps really not a big surprise, given after Iowa and certainly New Hampshire, he didn't really have a chance?
Well, you know, from the very beginning of this campaign, it was going to be an uphill slog for Governor DeSantis. I think that one of the things that we need to look back at this race, when Governor DeSantis got in, when Ambassador Haley got into the race, this was always Donald Trump's race to lose in the Republican Party. It really was. Within the Republican base, he was a very, very popular former president of the United States. He had all kinds of polling advantages, despite the fact that when there was an initial surge and a little rush of energy to Governor DeSantis when he initially got into the race. I think pragmatically, we knew this at the time. It's borne out now that this was really always Donald Trump's race to lose. And what, even reflectively looking back, what could Governor DeSantis have done differently? You know, you can always prognosticate looking backwards. But at the end of the day, I suspect historically that we're always going to view this as the race that Donald Trump was destined to win.
But there are some people who thought that at one time he was a legitimate threat to Donald Trump, but he experienced a number of miscalculations. What do you think were some of his biggest missteps? Maybe starting with the way he announced the start of his campaign?
Well, yeah, certainly the launch with Elon Musk was problematic at best. Whenever you're doing anything with Elon Musk, you never really know how that's going to come out at the end of the day. I think that when you're dealing with somebody like a Donald Trump, who is very, very charismatic, the DeSantis campaign was probably allowed no more than one misstep of some sort of kind. And the reality is that when you are stepping out of the state, regardless of Florida being a state of 21 million people, when you are leaving your state environment and you are stepping onto the national stage for the first time, there are going to be things that take place and issues that you have to navigate as a campaign and as a candidate, which are going to be new and first time and alien to you. That being said, all of this was magnified by the fact that Governor DeSantis was going against, and we've talked about this previously, Bruce, you know, within my lifetime of following politics, there have been 3 politicians that have had just kind of an outworldly way in which they conduct themselves. Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump. You know, whenever you get them into an environment, depending upon who they're targeting, Donald Trump to the Republican Party remains as popular a figure as he was when he was first elected. And that's just something that Governor DeSantis and Ambassador Haley have not been able to overcome in this race.
So Donald Trump says, I made Ron DeSantis, but Ron DeSantis became a very bitter rival, yet he turns around and endorses him. Any surprise, or is that just politics?
That's just politics. I mean, let's remember in 2016, and we can look back at this, when Donald Trump was in a bitter and hotly contested primary debate with Ted Cruz, if you'll recall. Donald Trump literally took to social media and called Ted Cruz's wife Heidi ugly on social media. Had Ted Cruz publicly come out and repudiate Trump, use foul language with Trump, say, hey, please don't call my wife that, by the way, in stronger language, and months later was phone banking for Donald Trump. So this is just the nature of politics. I think strategically that Governor DeSantis did the right thing to protect his future interests in politics, despite the fact that right now within his inner circle, within the DeSantis family, listen, Bruce, the one thing that whether you're Republican or Democrat, running for office is hard. You put yourself out there, you put your family out there, and there's going to be a lot of emotions in the days and weeks to come that they're going to have to deal with, that every candidate deals with. But I think the one thing that they're going to look as a positive for their future career is that the day that they got out of the race, that they took the time to acknowledge that Donald Trump was the leader of the party and to squarely get behind Donald Trump. And the reason I say that must have been a bitter pill for the DeSantis campaign to do, but pragmatically, they did the right thing politically in doing that.
Knowing full well that he probably wants to run again in 2028. And that said, let me go to a quote, because in announcing the end of his campaign, DeSantis said something that he attributed to Winston Churchill. The quote was, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." Trouble is, there's no evidence that the World War II leader ever said that. Another DeSantis misstep?
Couldn't tell you. Listen, Winston Churchill said a lot of things. He's kind of like Mark Twain, if you think about it. Every time you turn around, there's a new quote being attributed to Winston Churchill. I had never seen that. But, you know, listen, I think at the end of the day, perhaps that's symbolic of the campaign. Perhaps it's not. I think what Governor DeSantis needs to do now for his political career, you said it best. This is a guy that, in terms of our modern politics, is a whippersnapper, Bruce. He's a young man with a young family. He's in his 40s. He's got a lot of political career ahead of him. I think that if he gets in line with President Trump, I think if he comes back, if he continues to appeal to his Florida base, which, by the way, half of the state will continue to be really riled up with what the governor does. The Republicans here in Florida will continue to love Governor DeSantis. There could be easily another chapter in Governor DeSantis' national political career, depending upon how well he gets behind President Trump and how that plays out. The one thing that I would also say, too, about President Trump, despite the fact that he approaches a lot of individuals with rancor and division, President Trump politically is very pragmatic. If you look at some of the individuals, if you'll recall back in 2016, President Trump had a nickname for everybody, from Lion Ted Cruz to Low Energy Jeb and Senator Marco Rubio. I think he had a diminutive name for him. But Trump has come back and he's healed and he's welcomed all of these people into his party, into his brand. So I don't think that this is the end for Governor.
His brand of politics. I'm up against the clock, but I've got to ask you,
Yeah.
Before November, does Ron DeSantis stump for Trump, or does he just govern Florida?
He'll be stumping for Trump in no time flat. I think in Florida, perhaps even nationally at certain venues. Now, the one thing that we should be very quick of is, does this mean the end for former Ambassador Haley? We will have to see. The polls right now give Governor Trump a decided advantage. What I would say of this is that New Hampshire is a perfect storm for Nikki Haley. The fact that it's an open primary, the fact that you've been able to narrow this down to a two-person race, the fact that you are invested as heavily as she has been in New Hampshire. If former Ambassador Haley cannot get within double digits of Trump in New Hampshire, then I think that her exit, too, is being foretold right now as we diagnose this.
And that said, you know, New Hampshire is always full of surprises.
Always.
So we just do have to wait and see. All righty. Want to remind you, Vote 2024 Path to the Polls, special edition live this morning. Join me for that streaming series. You can watch it live on our YouTube channel, news4jax.com and News4Jax. Plus, that's again coming up at 10:30. All right, of course, this is the program you're watching right now. And, you know, Scott, I've got to wonder out loud. You and I talked about some of the reasons that Ron DeSantis wrapped things up when he did right now. I wonder if the GOP leadership just basically said, you know what, this is a sign that we want to just put all our eggs in one basket and give them to Donald Trump. Go ahead and do it now so we can have one candidate on the trail and give the GOP the decided advantage.
And is he rewarded for that in the future? One thing that fascinates me about the DeSantis question is he making calculations for his future? He is younger than almost all of them. He's 45 years old, so he's got a lot of time left. But I don't know where it goes from here. There's a lot of theories. So he's only got, I want to say, 3 years left as governor. So he's almost to the point of being a lame duck governor. And by lame duck, I mean the campaign to replace him will begin in the next year.
year and a half.
Yeah. So that's going to happen, and no one's really going to be paying attention because they'll be focused on the presidential race for the next year. And then where does he go? I mean, does he run for Senate? I don't know that he'd run against Marco Rubio, who's in his own party. Would Trump put him in the cabinet? Does he do something else to just gin up excitement for a run in 28? Because Trump's only going to, if he won, or Biden, if he won, it's only going to be 4 years. Eventually that 2028 campaign is probably going to be starting about 2 years from now.
Yeah, I think for the next foreseeable 6-7 months that he worries about Florida's agenda, stumps for Trump, and then we do find him in Washington in some sort of a position.
I do want to point this out. This was interesting from A.G. Gankarski, the Florida politics reporter there. And he told me this was interesting about DeSantis when he comes back to Florida, because DeSantis has been a very big culture warrior in the state. He's hit those very difficult subjects, possibly because he's going to run for president. That would be the transgender issue. That would be a lot of the school curriculum issues, the picking a fight with Disney, all that type of stuff. Gankarski speculated he may come back and moderate a little because he's not running for president right now.
It's, you know, I think you just read my mind, because I think when we see Ron DeSantis come back on the presidential campaign trail, and notice I didn't say if, when we see him come back in 2028. I think you'll see a very different Ron DeSantis, because I think there's some lessons learned. Even he admitted, just was it last week, look, I probably shouldn't have just talked with the conservative media. I should have talked to the mainstream media as well. He has been criticized for, constantly harping on certain words like woke and the whole COVID situation and things like that. He is going to have to moderate his stance on some things.
And in 28 is going to be so hugely different than what we saw. There will be no Donald Trump, and it will probably every Republican you can think of with a national platform is probably going to try to run for president. So it's going to be, I mean, remember that some of those years, those election cycles past where we see like 16 people on the stage, all jockeying for position. And without Donald Trump to, suck all the attention in the room toward him, it will be interesting to see how that goes. And if DeSantis, because last year he was very popular with his base and he got a lot of attention. Will he be able to still get that attention in 2 years? We'll have to see.
And who would the Democrats field?
Yes,
Which
and
would
they're
be
going to be going
variable.
through the exact same thing.
Exactly, exactly. Is there some, because I think there's a thirst in America for a younger, more vibrant politician, on both sides of the aisle. And they want somebody who is, and I don't think the term Republican and Democrat really defines those parties as they did in the past. I think that the American public wants somebody different.
And Nikki Haley yesterday, she was asked by Dana Bash of CNN, and we ran that soundbite here at Channel 4, what are you going to do? Are you going to drop out? And she's like, I'm not going to drop out. I'm going to win this. And then this is what she pointed out. She goes, look, polling shows 70% of voters don't want a Biden-Trump rematch. If that's remotely accurate, that polling number, it does show that there is that thirst to move on, but it may not be happening this election cycle.
She's not going to drop out unless she loses by a large margin, unless the GOP leadership says to her, look, it's time.
And I do want to mention something because I pulled up the calendar because everyone's so focused on Nevada, or not Nevada, excuse me, New Hampshire tomorrow, that you got it. We're going to have a large gap. So we've got Nevada and the Virgin Islands on the 8th of February. So that'll be a couple weeks away.
And South Carolina's not till the end of the month.
South Carolina, the 24th. But after South Carolina, if Nikki Haley is still in it, then it gets crazy.
Super Tuesday.
You got Super Tuesday within days of South Carolina. You've got Michigan, Idaho, Missouri, Washington, D.C., North Dakota. Super Tuesday with 16 states. Then it finally gets to us in Georgia and Florida. But if she holds through South Carolina and can still be a viable candidate, then the rubber's really going to meet the road as all these states vote in a short amount of time.
But if you listen to a lot of the political pundits, and this is not me, a lot of the political pundits say, look, we're not going to get that far.
Yeah.
Those primaries are going to be irrelevant. And let me go back to, I mentioned Whit Ayers, a longtime GOP pollster a little while ago. He says, the entire issue is this fundamental. The entire GOP is defined by their attitude toward Donald Trump. Do you want to stay with him or go with somebody different? Is what happens going forward in this primary that simple? And I think the answer is yes. Scott, it's been a pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Bruce, thanks for having me on.
And then we have another streaming edition of Vote 2024, Path to the Polls, tomorrow at 10:30. I'm joined by News4Jax political analyst and head of the Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute, Rick Mullaney. We're going to talk more about New Hampshire. What can happen there? What kind of surprises? What kind of upsets? More than 36 hours will have passed since Ron DeSantis left the campaign trail. Will Nikki Haley have changed the way she politics? Will she have picked up more support? Will Donald Trump widen the gap? What are the implications? We find out. So join me right here on Vote 2024. You can watch on our News4Jax YouTube channel, news4jax.com, and News4Jax Plus. We appreciate your time.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.